June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, 140 miles north of Yap Island. Commander Mitsueo Matsuda stood on the flight deck of the carrier Shokaku, watching aircraft return from morning strike missions that had gone catastrophically wrong, though the full extent of the disaster wouldn't be clear for hours yet. The pilots climbing from their cockpits looked shaken, spoke in hushed tones about American fighters that had torn through their formations like wolves through sheep, about defensive fire so intense it seemed impossible to penetrate. Matsuda had been the air officer of this carrier since before Pearl Harbor, had supervised flight operations for nearly 3 years of continuous combat, had watched this ship and her air groups evolve from a fresh commission to a battle-hardened veteran of every major carrier engagement except Midway. Around him stretched Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, 9 carriers with supporting battleships and cruisers, the largest concentration of Japanese carrier power that could be assembled in mid-1944 and what Japanese naval leadership believed might be their last opportunity to achieve a decisive victory that could alter the trajectory of a war that was slipping away. The deck crews worked with practiced efficiency despite their exhaustion, refueling and rearming aircraft for another sortie, moving ordnance from magazines to waiting planes, opening fuel lines to top off tanks that had been depleted during the morning missions. What Matsuda didn't know, what none of the 1,200 men aboard Shokaku could have imagined as they prepared for afternoon operations, was that 800 feet below the surface, Commander Herman Kostler aboard the submarine USS Cavalla had been tracking the Japanese fleet for hours and was now in perfect attack position. Within 20 minutes, Kostler would give the order to fire 6 torpedoes that would tear the heart out of Shokaku and send her to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean along with 1,200 men. The carrier that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had fought at Coral Sea and Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, that represented nearly 3 years of combat operations and embodied the skill and experience of Japanese naval aviation's finest generation, would be gone before sunset. And with her would die the last hope that Japan's carriers could still compete with American naval power that had grown overwhelming. The story of how USS Cavalla, a submarine on her very first war patrol, sank one of Japan's most veteran aircraft carriers begins months earlier in February 1944, when Cavalla was commissioned at Groton, Connecticut under Commander Herman Kostler. The submarine was a Gato-class boat, one of the workhorses of American submarine warfare that combined range, habitability, and firepower in a package that proved devastatingly effective against Japanese shipping. 311 feet long, displacing 1,500 tons surfaced and 2,400 tons submerged, capable of diving to over 300 feet and staying submerged for extended periods. Armed with 10 torpedo tubes and carrying 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, Cavalla represented American submarine design at its mature peak. The Mark 14 torpedo, after years of problems with depth keeping and faulty magnetic exploders that had plagued the early war years, had finally been fixed and was now functioning as intended, which meant American submarines could reliably sink targets they'd previously only damaged. Kostler, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1934, had spent years preparing for submarine command, had served aboard other boats, had learned the patience and aggressive instinct that made successful submarine commanders. His crew was young, many of them fresh from training, but they'd been drilled relentlessly during their shakedown period, and Kostler believed they were ready for combat operations. On May 31, 1944, Cavalla departed Pearl Harbor on her first war patrol with orders to proceed to the Philippine Sea and take up position along likely approach routes for Japanese fleet, units that intelligence suggested might be moving to counter American operations in the Marianas. The patrol was supposed to be routine, a first mission that would blood the crew and teach them the realities of submarine warfare in waters where Japanese anti-submarine forces were skilled and aggressive. Nobody aboard Cavalla expected they'd encounter a major Japanese fleet action. Nobody imagined they'd get a shot at a fleet carrier. The unexpected opportunity that would come represented the kind of luck that submarine commanders prayed for, but rarely received. Meanwhile, the carrier Shokaku had been preparing for what Japanese naval leadership called Operation Eigo, the plan to destroy American carrier forces and reverse the momentum of a war that had turned decisively against Japan since the disaster at Midway 2 years earlier. Shokaku's history embodied the trajectory of Japanese naval fortunes from triumph to desperation. She'd been commissioned in August 1941 at Yokosuka, one of 2 carriers of her class, that represented Japan's commitment to carrier aviation as the decisive weapon of modern naval warfare. Her dimensions were impressive, 845 feet long, displacing 32,000 tons fully loaded, capable of operating 72 aircraft from a flight deck that stretched nearly her entire length. The design incorporated lessons from earlier carriers and reflected Japanese understanding of carrier operations developed through years of study and combat experience in China. When she joined the 1st Air Fleet in October 1941, she brought with her an air group trained to standards that no other navy could match. Japanese naval aviators in 1941 spent 3 to 4 years in training programs that washed out the vast majority of candidates, producing pilots who could navigate by dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of ocean, land on carriers at night, deliver weapons with precision that Allied pilots wouldn't match for years. On December 7, 1941, Shokaku launched 27 aircraft as part of the first wave that struck Pearl Harbor. Because her aircrew were considered slightly less experienced than those from the older fleet carriers, they were assigned secondary targets rather than the battleships that were the primary objective. But they still contributed to the devastating attack that sank or damaged 18 American warships and drew the United States into war. Over the following months, Shokaku participated in the Indian Ocean raid that drove British naval forces from eastern waters and demonstrated Japanese carrier power across half the globe. The string of victories seemed to confirm that Japanese naval aviation was invincible, that the years of intensive training and careful preparation had created a force that could dominate any enemy. But the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942 shattered that illusion when American carriers intercepted Japanese forces, and in the confused fighting that followed, Shokaku took multiple bomb hits that left her flight deck too damaged to operate aircraft. She survived and limped back to Japan for repairs, but she'd miss Midway, where 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups would be lost in a single day. By June 1944, after 2 years of grinding attrition warfare in the Solomons and Central Pacific, Shokaku was one of only 3 fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor still in service. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been sunk at Midway. Zoikaku, Shokaku's sister ship, remained operational, but her air group had been so depleted through constant combat that she was less effective than her intact hull suggested. The pilots flying from Shokaku's deck in 1944 bore little resemblance to the veterans who'd struck Pearl Harbor. Most of the pre-war trained aviators were dead, shot down over the Solomons or lost at sea when their carriers were sunk. The replacements had been rushed through abbreviated training programs because Japan's situation was so desperate it couldn't afford the 3-year training cycle that had produced the Pearl Harbor generation. These new pilots had maybe 6 months of training, sometimes less, just enough to be dangerous to themselves and minimally functional in combat. They could take off and land on carriers, could fly formation, could deliver weapons if given clear targets and no opposition, but they couldn't navigate complex tactical situations, couldn't adapt to unexpected circumstances, couldn't survive against American pilots who now had superior training, better aircraft, and combat experience that had been hard-won through 2 years of Pacific fighting. The qualitative gap between Japanese and American naval aviation had inverted completely since 1941, and Operation Ago was sending these barely trained pilots against American carrier forces that had been perfected into a killing machine that would demonstrate exactly how wide that gap had become. Admiral Ozawa's plan relied on Japanese aircraft having longer range than American planes, which meant Japanese carriers could launch strikes from distances where American carriers couldn't respond directly. The theory was sound, but it assumed Japanese pilots could successfully attack American carriers despite American fighter defenses and anti-aircraft fire that had been dramatically improved through technological advancement and tactical refinement. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. On the morning of June 19th, Ozawa launched his first strike. 69 aircraft aimed at American carrier forces that had been located by Japanese search planes. American radar detected the incoming raid 150 miles out, which gave defending fighters time to climb to altitude and position themselves for interception. The American fighter direction system, refined through years of combat experience, vectored Grumman F-6F Hellcats onto the Japanese formation long before it reached the carriers. What followed was slaughter. The Hellcats were faster, more rugged, more heavily armed than the Zero fighters escorting Japanese bombers, and the American pilots flying them had been trained for 18 months and had accumulated hundreds of flying hours before being sent into combat. The Japanese formation disintegrated under the assault. Bombers and fighters shot down in numbers that seemed impossible. Of 69 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 returned to their carriers. The second strike of 130 aircraft fared even worse, losing 98 planes. The third and fourth strikes were similarly devastated. By the end of the day, Japanese carriers would launch over 370 aircraft and lose approximately 300 of them, along with their irreplaceable crews. American pilots, returning to their carriers and describing the ease with which they'd shot down Japanese aircraft, used the term turkey shoot to capture how one-sided the combat had been. American losses for the entire day were 30 aircraft, almost all to operational causes rather than enemy action. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was categorical, a demonstration that Japanese naval aviation had been so degraded by 2 years of attrition that it could no longer function effectively against American forces that had grown overwhelming in every dimension that mattered. While this aerial massacre unfolded above the Philippine Sea, USS Cavalla was running submerged, tracking propeller sounds that indicated major surface units nearby. Kostler had positioned his submarine along what intelligence believed would be likely approach routes for Japanese fleet units, and on the morning of June 19th, his patience was rewarded when Cavalla's sonar operator detected multiple contacts moving at high speed. Kostler brought the submarine to periscope depth and saw what every submarine commander dreamed of: Japanese carriers, screening vessels, a major task force steaming almost directly toward his position. The tactical problem was straightforward, but extraordinarily difficult. Carriers moving at 25 knots or more presented challenging targets for submarines, whose best underwater speed was less than 10 knots. Cavalla would get one opportunity, maybe two if circumstances were favorable, to maneuver into firing position. If Kostler missed or was detected before firing, the screening destroyers would pin him down with depth charges, and the opportunity would be lost forever. For hours, Kostler tracked the Japanese formation, calculating courses and speeds, maneuvering his submarine to intercept, maintaining periscope depth long enough to update his tracking solution, but not so long that Japanese lookouts might spot the periscope wake cutting through the water. The tension aboard Cavalla was extraordinary, every man understanding they were stalking one of the most valuable targets in the Japanese Navy. Knowing that success meant glory and failure meant death, or at minimum the loss of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. By late morning, Kostler had maneuvered Cavalla into position ahead of one large carrier that he identified from silhouette recognition as possibly Shokaku herself. Though submarine periscope observations were never certain enough for definitive identification. The carrier was recovering aircraft, her flight deck crowded with planes that had returned from strike missions, deck crews rushing to service them for another launch. This was the most vulnerable moment for any carrier, when aircraft were spotted on deck, with fuel lines connected and ordnance being moved from below, when a single spark could trigger cascading fires and explosions that could consume the entire ship. At 11:20 hours, with range close to 1,200 yards and the carrier's course steady, Kostler gave the order that every submariner trained for: Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes left Cavalla's forward tubes in rapid succession, each weapon running at 46 knots toward the massive target that filled Kostler's periscope view. The crew counted seconds that felt like hours, listening through the hull for sounds that would indicate success or failure. At approximately 70 seconds, the first explosion, then a second, then a third. The sounds merged into a continuous roar that made precise counting impossible, but Kostler believed he'd achieved at least 3 hits, possibly 4. He took one last look through the periscope and saw the carrier listing to starboard, smoke rising from her midship section, aircraft on her deck sliding sideways as the ship heeled over. Then, because submarine commanders who lingered after attacks rarely survived, Kostler ordered Cavalla deep and rigged for depth charges. The screening destroyers would be coming for them with everything they had, and Cavalla's only chance was to go silent, shut down all non-essential systems, and hope they could evade detection long enough for the destroyers to give up and return to their fleet. What followed was 3 hours of hell, depth charges exploding close enough to rock the submarine and shatter light bulbs, far enough that the pressure hull held, but close enough that every man aboard wondered if the next pattern would be the one that crushed them. Equipment failed, ventilation pipes flooded. The temperature rose as the submarine's air conditioning couldn't function during silent running, but through training and discipline and sheer determination, Cavalla survived. When the depth charging finally ceased and Kostler brought his submarine back to periscope depth, the sea was empty except for oil slicks and debris that marked where the carrier had been. He drafted his patrol report with the careful language submarine commanders used when claims couldn't be immediately verified. Probable carrier sinking. Heavy damage observed. Target believed sunk based on list and damage visible before diving. The confirmation would come later from intelligence analysis and Japanese records, but Kostler knew in his gut that they'd killed that carrier. Aboard Shokaku, the torpedo impacts created immediate catastrophe that would determine the carrier's fate within seconds. 3 torpedoes, possibly 4 depending on whose account you believe, struck the starboard side between the forward elevator and amidships, tearing massive holes in the hull and flooding multiple compartments instantly. One torpedo hit near the forward aviation fuel tanks, rupturing fuel lines that fed gasoline to aircraft on the flight deck. The explosion ignited volatile aviation gasoline that had been flowing through open lines to service aircraft, and within seconds, fires erupted across the forward section of the flight deck. Aircraft that had just landed and were being refueled exploded into flames, their fuel tanks detonating and spreading burning gasoline across the deck. The fires spread to the hangar deck, where more aircraft were spotted, touching off a chain reaction of explosions as fuel tanks and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. Commander Matsuda, thrown to the deck by the first explosion, scrambled to his feet and saw his worst nightmare unfolding. Cascading fires in spaces packed with aircraft, fuel and ordnance, the kind of disaster that had haunted carrier sailors since the first carriers had been built. Damage control parties responded with training and courage, attacking fires with foam and water, trying to contain damage that was already beyond control. The forward magazines were flooded to prevent catastrophic explosion, but the fires burning in the hangar deck and spreading through ventilation systems couldn't be stopped by measures designed for more limited damage. The list increased as flooding from torpedo damage progressed, and as water used for firefighting accumulated on lower decks. Smoke filled spaces below the hangar deck, killing men who couldn't escape through blocked passageways or jammed hatches. Aircraft on the flight deck that hadn't been secured began sliding into the ocean, as the list reached 15 degrees, then 20, then more. Destroyer escorts moved alongside to assist with firefighting and evacuation, but rough seas and the carrier's increasing list made it nearly impossible to maintain position. By early afternoon, Captain Hiroshi Matsubara understood his ship was doomed and gave the order to abandon ship, sending 1,200 men over the side into oil-covered water, where rescue would be difficult and survival uncertain. At 15:10 hours, 3 hours and 50 minutes after Cavalla's torpedoes struck, Shokaku's list became critical and she began her final plunge. The bow went under first, and then the massive hull 845 feet of steel that had been one of Japan's finest carriers slid beneath the surface in a maelstrom of steam and debris and oil. She took with her 1,272 men who'd either died in the initial torpedo strikes and subsequent fires or who'd been unable to escape before the ship went down. Among the dead were veterans who'd served aboard since commissioning, who'd attacked Pearl Harbor and survived Coral Sea and fought through 2 years of grinding attrition warfare. Among the dead were young sailors on their first deployment, boys barely out of training, who'd believed they were joining a veteran ship with a veteran crew and who'd found themselves instead aboard a vessel that had been worn down by years of combat and maintenance deferred due to resource shortages. Among the dead were the pilots and aircrew who'd been in their ready rooms or their berthing spaces when the torpedoes hit, who'd never had a chance to reach the flight deck before fires and smoke cut off escape routes. The survivors, approximately 570 men pulled from the water by destroyers Urakazi and Hatsuzuki and the light cruiser Yahagi, would eventually return to a Japan that no longer had functioning carriers for them to serve aboard, where their specialized skills as carrier sailors had become useless, where they would be reassigned to shore billets or surface ships, or sent to defend islands that would inevitably be overrun by American forces advancing across the Pacific. Commander Matsuda survived, pulled from oil-covered water after nearly an hour swimming through debris and floating wreckage. He would carry guilt about surviving when so many of his men died, would struggle for the rest of his life with questions about whether he could have done something different, whether his decisions during those frantic minutes after the torpedoes struck had cost lives or saved them, whether there had ever been any possibility of saving Shokaku once Cavalla's torpedoes tore open her hull and ignited her aviation fuel systems. The sinking of Shokaku, combined with the loss of the carrier Taiho to another American submarine earlier the same day, and the destruction of over 300 Japanese aircraft with their crews, effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet retreated westward, having accomplished nothing except the sacrifice of irreplaceable assets. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which Japanese planners had envisioned as the decisive engagement that would reverse the war's momentum, instead became the death of Japanese naval aviation. Japan would still possess carriers after this battle, would even deploy them in future operations, but she lacked the aircraft and especially the trained pilots to make those carriers effective combat platforms. The training programs that had produced the Pearl Harbor generation required 3 to 4 years per pilot, and Japan in mid-1944 had neither the time nor the resources nor the fuel to run such programs. The replacement pilots being rushed through abbreviated training were barely capable of taking off and landing on carriers, let alone executing complex combat operations against American forces that had been perfected through years of warfare. American losses in the battle were 123 aircraft, most lost to operational causes, and minor damage to a few carriers that were repaired and returned to service within weeks. The disparity wasn't just in this single battle, but in the underlying capacity to sustain losses and rebuild. Every Japanese pilot killed represented months of training that couldn't be shortened without producing pilots who were functionally useless. Every American pilot killed was replaced by men graduating from training programs that produced thousands of pilots annually. Every Japanese carrier sunk was irreplaceable given Japan's industrial limitations and the submarine blockade strangling her resources. Every American carrier damaged was repaired or replaced by new construction that was building carriers faster than they could be sunk. The mathematics of attrition had always favored America, but by mid-1944 those mathematics had become so lopsided that continued fighting was essentially suicide for Japan, though cultural and political factors meant Japan would continue fighting for another 14 months at the cost of hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. For the men who'd served aboard Shokaku and survived her sinking, the months and years after June 19, 1944, were marked by the peculiar trauma that comes from surviving when comrades died, from watching something you'd believed was permanent and powerful disappear in hours, from understanding that the cause you'd fought for was lost, but being powerless to stop the continued sacrifice. Commander Matsuda was reassigned to shore duty, training pilots for carrier operations that would never happen because Japan no longer had functioning carriers. Other survivors went to shore billets or to surface ships, their specialized carrier skills useless in a navy that was being systematically destroyed by American submarines and aircraft. Some survivors ended up defending Pacific islands against American invasions, fighting hopeless battles on places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders were killed in numbers that reflected how completely American material superiority had tilted the balance. The carrier warfare expertise these men possessed, skills developed through years of training and combat experience, became obsolete in a matter of months, as American forces achieved such overwhelming superiority that Japanese resistance became suicidal rather than merely difficult. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Shokaku survivors scattered across the ruins of their defeated nation, returning to families and communities that had been devastated by strategic bombing and economic collapse, trying to rebuild lives in a country that would need decades to recover from the war it had started, and lost so catastrophically. For many of these men, the memory of Shokaku would remain the defining experience of their lives, the moment when they'd believed they were part of something powerful and permanent, and had learned through the most brutal possible lesson that nothing in war is permanent, and that power, without the resources to sustain it, becomes weakness that enemies exploit without mercy. Commander Herman Kostler and USS Cavalla returned to Pearl Harbor in August 1944 after completing their first war patrol, which had been spectacularly successful despite the extended depth charge attack they'd endured after sinking Shokaku. Kostler's patrol report was studied by submarine commanders throughout the Pacific as an example of patient tracking, precise attack execution, and successful evasion of counterattack. Cavalla received a Presidential Unit citation for her first patrol, and Kostler was awarded the Navy Cross for his command during the engagement. The submarine would go on to complete 5 more war patrols, sinking additional Japanese vessels, including the destroyer Shimotsuki, in November 1944. But nothing would equal the significance of that first patrol when a submarine on her maiden voyage sank one of Japan's most veteran carriers. After the war, Cavalla was retained in service, underwent modernization, served during the Cold War as a training submarine, and eventually was decommissioned and preserved as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas, where she remains today, one of the few Gato-class submarines that survived the war and the subsequent decades to serve as a memorial to the men who fought in submarines during World War II. Kostler continued his naval career, eventually rising to Rear Admiral, commanding multiple submarines and submarine squadrons, passing on the lessons he'd learned during that first patrol to subsequent generations of submarine officers who would apply those lessons during the Cold War when American submarines tracked Soviet vessels with the same patience and precision that Cavalla had used to track Shokaku. He retired in the 1960s and lived another 30 years, passing away in 1993. His obituaries noting his role in sinking Shokaku and describing him as one of the successful submarine commanders who'd helped win the Pacific War through aggressive patrol tactics and effective use of the weapons and capabilities American industry had provided. In 1985, at a Naval History Symposium in Washington, D.C., a meeting occurred that brought together perspectives from both sides of that June day in 1944. Herman Kostler, by then in his 70s and long retired, was speaking about submarine warfare in the Pacific when he was approached by a Japanese man who introduced himself through an interpreter as having served aboard Shokaku and survived her sinking. The man's name was lost to time in Kostler's recollection, but the conversation that followed captured something essential about how veterans from opposing sides process shared experiences decades after the events. The Japanese survivor wanted to understand what had happened beneath the surface while his world was exploding above it, wanted to hear from the American commander who'd given the order that killed 1,200 of his shipmates. Kostler, with the directness that characterized naval officers of his generation, described Cavalla's approach, the tracking of the Japanese formation, the decision to fire based on optimal range and target angle. He'd done his job, executed his mission, achieved results that helped America win the war. Did he feel guilt about the men who died? He felt sympathy for anyone who died in combat. But submariners attacked without warning, and their targets had no chance to defend themselves. And that was the nature of submarine warfare, that everyone who chose submarines understood and accepted. The Japanese survivor listened, and then asked a question that Kostler found difficult to answer. Did he think the sinking of Shokaku had been necessary, or had Japan already been so close to defeat that the additional deaths were pointless? Kostler paused for a long time before responding that military commanders didn't get to choose which targets were necessary. They executed the missions they were assigned, with the understanding that political and strategic leaders had determined those missions served national objectives. Whether sinking Shokaku shortened the war by days or weeks or months, he couldn't say. Whether the 1,200 men who died would have survived the war if Shokaku hadn't been sunk, he couldn't know. War created situations where people died because other people made decisions about how to achieve victory. And once you accepted that framework, questions about individual necessity became impossible to answer. The Japanese survivor nodded, seemingly satisfied not with the answer, but with Kostler's honesty about its limitations, and thanked him for speaking truthfully, rather than offering comfortable platitudes about necessary sacrifices and greater goods that veterans knew were more complicated than such phrases suggested. The story of USS Cavalla sinking Shokaku is ultimately a story about the intersection of technology, training, and industrial capacity that determined the outcome of the Pacific War. Cavalla was a modern submarine, one of many being produced by American shipyards at rates that Japan couldn't approach, equipped with radar and sonar that gave her detection capabilities Japanese anti-submarine forces couldn't match, armed with torpedoes that finally worked after years of fixes to problems that had plagued early war operations, crewed by men trained to standards that emphasized both technical competence and tactical aggression. Shokaku was a first-line fleet carrier that had been cutting-edge when commissioned in 1941, but had been worn down by 3 years of continuous combat operations, that carried an air group whose quality had declined catastrophically as veteran pilots were killed and replaced by undertrained novices, that represented a navy that had been bled white by attrition warfare against an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. The encounter between these vessels lasted minutes, the torpedo attack execution taking seconds, the depth charge counterattack lasting hours, but ultimately failing to destroy the submarine that had delivered the fatal blow. In those minutes, one of Japan's finest carriers was doomed. 1,200 men were killed, and the last hopes for Japanese carrier aviation were extinguished. The sinking of Shokaku was one moment among thousands, in a war that lasted years and killed millions. But for the men directly involved, it was the defining experience of their naval service, the intersection point where training and luck and timing came together to create outcomes that shaped individual lives and contributed to national victory. Herman Kostler did what American submarine commanders were trained to do: found a target, maneuvered into position, fired torpedoes, and evaded counterattack. The execution was professional, the results were devastating, and the contribution to Allied victory was significant, even if impossible to quantify precisely. That the attack also meant 1,200 men died was the tragic reality of warfare that no tactical success could eliminate or justify beyond the brutal calculus that winning wars requires killing enemies until they can no longer resist. Cavalla proved it with 6 torpedoes fired on a June morning in 1944, sending Shokaku and her crew to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, ending the career of a carrier that had served Japan from Pearl Harbor to her final day, demonstrating once more that the technological and industrial advantages America possessed had become so overwhelming that Japanese resistance, however determined, could only delay the inevitable outcome that had been determined by decisions made before the first shots were fired.